Camp
All right, kids, let's
Kindervelt,
keep the line
Sullivan
moving.
County,
Remember
Catskill
your
Mountains,
bunk
New
numbers.
York.
Goodbye,
Day 3 of the
counselor.
first
Have a
session,
great
summer
summer.
1948, 2:30 in the afternoon. Ellie Greenbaum, 10 years old, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, first year at camp. The letter to her mother had been started on day 1 and not finished. What she had written on day 1 began in English and shifted, by the second paragraph, into a Yiddish phrase, Es geht mir gut, I am well, that she had not planned to write. She had crossed it out and written the English instead. Then she had stopped. Ruth Levine, entering her 3rd summer at this camp, saw the letter on the outdoor table before she saw Ellie at the outdoor table. She saw the crossed-out Yiddish before she saw the English that replaced it. She knew what the crossing out meant. She had been the girl who crossed it out at 12, at this same camp, in this same first session, when the words that came first were the wrong ones for a letter, supposed to show that everything here was fine. Surprise Lake Camp, founded in 1902 by the Educational Alliance, the settlement house on Manhattan's Lower East Side, serving East European Jewish immigrants, is the oldest Jewish residential summer camp in the United States. Its first season had 25 boys, 6 tents, and 5 counselors. Eddie Cantor was among its first campers. Camp Kinderland was founded in 1923 by the Workmen's Circle. Camp Shamria in Liberty, New York, Sullivan County, was Hashomer Hatzer's Zionist camp in the Catskills proper, founded in the 1940s. By the 1950s, the Catskills Institute documents that more than 1 million people were spending summers in the bungalow colonies, hotels, and summer camps of Sullivan and Ulster counties. These institutions, the Catskills Institute records, shaped American Jewish culture, enabling Jews to become more American, while at the same time introducing the American public to immigrant Jewish culture. What the children in the bunks were living inside was not a compromise between two traditions. It was something that required both to exist at the same time, in the same afternoon. What exactly was it building? Day 3 at a Catskills Jewish camp was not the same as Day 3 at a Maine Lake camp or an Adirondack private camp. The distance from Crown Heights to Sullivan County was 90 to 150 miles, nothing like the overnight train to Portland. Ellie Greenbaum's parents could have driven to the camp and driven home in a single afternoon. That accessibility was part of the tradition's design. The Catskills were reachable by bus and train from the Lower East Side, from the Bronx, from Brooklyn, without the cost of a sleeping car. But proximity did not eliminate the interval. Day 3 at 2:30 was still Day 3 at 2:30. The letter was still unfinished. The crossed-out Yiddish phrase was still crossed out, and what Ruth Levine knew about Day 3 that was specific to this camp, to this community, this letter, this specific crossing out, was not the same thing a counselor at a general private camp 3 hours from New York would have known. The interval here had its own texture. What gave it that texture? The counselor orientation at Camp Kindervelt had not covered the crossed-out Yiddish. It had covered emergency procedures, program planning, the daily schedule. It had not covered what it meant when a 10-year-old from Crown Heights started a letter in English and slipped, by the second paragraph, into a phrase her grandmother used, and then erased it. The erasure was not embarrassment about the Yiddish. Ruth Levine knew it was not embarrassment, because at 12 she had done the same thing at this same camp, and what she had felt was not shame. What she had felt was the specific confusion of a child who existed fluently in 2 registers, English at school, Yiddish at home, both in the hallway between, and had been asked to write a letter in only one. The erasure was not the child choosing one over the other. It was the child trying to find a single language for an experience that was happening in 2. What Ruth knew about Day 3 was inseparable from what she knew about that erasure. She had not been taught to know either one. She had been the child who made them. What arrived by Day 7 in a Catskills Jewish camp was shaped by the structure the camp had built around the interval. The first Friday evening at camp, which arrived at the end of Week 1, was the hinge. Accounts of Jewish camp life in the 1940s and 1950s document the Shabbat ceremony as a deliberate and anticipated event. The candles lit at the dining hall tables, the blessings said in Hebrew, the meal slightly better than the weekday norm. Children struggling through their first week in the bunk, the unfinished letters, the comprehension of duration, arrived at Friday evening inside a ceremony that named the week's end. The camp had not invented this structure. It had borrowed it from Jewish time and placed it inside the residential ark. What the Shabbat ceremony gave the interval between day 3 and day 7 was a specific destination, not only belonging to the bunk, arriving at Friday evening inside a community that had made the week together. What did that destination produce? The Shabbat ceremony in a Catskills Jewish summer camp happened on Friday evening in the dining hall. Candles were lit at the long wooden tables. Hebrew blessings were said over bread and wine. The meal was slightly better than the weekday norm. Accounts of Jewish camp life document this as a noticed improvement that children anticipated and observed. Children who had grown up with Shabbat at home encountered it at a table with 40 other children who also knew the words, in a building where Wednesday lunch had been organized noise and Friday dinner was something else. Children who had not grown up with Shabbat encountered it surrounded by a community for which it was a given. What happened at that table was not religious instruction. The candles were already lit by the time you arrived. By the time the meal ended, you had been inside a ceremony you either already knew or had just been given. What did receiving it in public produce that learning it at home could not? Atlas Obscura's documentation of 1940s, 1950s Jewish summer camps records the dual program explicitly. While the camps kept kosher and observed Shabbat, they also celebrated the 4th of July. Morning Hebrew instruction, afternoon baseball, Yiddish folk songs at evening assembly, the 4th of July flag raising alongside the weekday colors. The camp was not asking a child to choose. It was building a child who did not experience this as a choice. The counselors who ran the morning cultural session and then changed into their baseball coaching clothes were demonstrating the dual identity through their schedules and their bodies, rather than through a lecture. What the camp transmitted was not primarily knowledge of Hebrew or Yiddish, though children did learn songs they had not known. It was the experiential knowledge that both belonged in the same person, in the same week, without apology or explanation. What happened in a child who lived through 6 weeks of that without being asked to resolve the contradiction? What a letter from Camp Kindervelt meant to a parent on the Lower East Side or in Crown Heights was not what a letter from a Maine private camp meant to a family in Back Bay, Boston. The parent reading Ellie's letter was, in many cases, an immigrant who had come from Eastern Europe in the early years of the century. She had built a life in a new country. She had sent her daughter to summer camp, what American families did with their children in summer. She was reading the letter for 2 things simultaneously, that the child was safe and well, and that the child still knew who she was. The paragraph she read most carefully, documented in accounts of Jewish camp parenting from this period, was the paragraph about Shabbat, not because it was more important than the paragraph about swimming, because it was the paragraph that told her both things at once. The bunk at a Jewish organizational camp was not a random cross-section of American childhood. Every child in it was Jewish, but that shared identity contained an enormous internal variety that the bunk made visible. A child from a Lower East Side family who spoke Yiddish at home shared a bunk with a child from Forest Hills whose grandparents' Yiddish was already fading. A child on a Workman's Circle scholarship shared a bunk with a child whose father was a physician who paid the full fee. Surprise Lake Camp documented its founding policy of providing camp access regardless of ability to pay, and the bunk that resulted was the social laboratory of the Jewish community's internal economic and cultural range. The camp had not designed these differences into the bunk assignments. It had not designed them out either. What did 6 weeks with the full range of a single community, held together by shared identity but divided by everything else, produce in children who had assumed the community was uniform? Many Catskills Jewish camps had swimming pools rather than natural lakes, because the camp sat on former farmland without direct lake access. For children who had grown up in Brownsville, in Williamsburg, in Crown Heights, who knew water as fire hydrants opened in summer streets and the municipal pool on Tuesday mornings, the camp waterfront was the first sustained encounter with water as a skill to develop rather than a temperature to escape. The swim test at the session's start determined what a child could do and where she could go. Passing it produced the same specific knowledge at a Catskills camp as at a Maine or Wisconsin camp, that she could move through water under her own direction. The pool, or the small reservoir, was not Sebago Lake. The knowledge was the same. What did earning that knowledge here, inside this community, at this specific camp, from children who had grown up on the same streets, mean for how it was carried home in August? The camp newspaper at a Jewish organizational camp was mimeographed in the craft cabin, assembled by a rotating committee of children, and distributed at dinner. The Center for Jewish History archives for camps in this tradition document camp newspapers, songs, cheers, parodies, as standard products of the cultural program. What the newspaper produced was specific to this kind of camp, a publication that mixed English and Yiddish in the same jokes, the same observations about who lost yesterday's baseball game. The editors had not been assigned to mix the languages. They mixed them because that was how the camp community spoke, switching registers mid-sentence, the same way Ellie had switched them mid-paragraph in her letter. Except here, the switching was not crossed out. It was printed and handed to the counselors and the whole camp at dinner. The newspaper was the documentation of what the bunk had built over 6 weeks. Children who had invented a common voice that belonged to both languages at once, without apology. What happened to that voice when August ended? Not all Catskills Jewish camps were the same. By the 1940s, 1950s, the Center for Jewish History documents that there was a camp for every kind of Jew, cultural, Zionist, Yiddishist, Hebraist, socialist, conservative, reform, and Orthodox. Camp Shomria in Liberty, New York, Hashomer Hatzer's camp in Sullivan County, was explicitly socialist Zionist, its program a preparation for building a Jewish state. Camp Masad, first in the Catskills, used Hebrew exclusively, making the language of the country still being built the language of the bunk. Camp Kinderland, the workmen's circle camp, was secular and Yiddishist, rooted in a socialist tradition that saw Yiddish as the authentic language of the Jewish working class. What these camps shared was not ideology. It was the structural conviction that 8 weeks in a bunk could do something that a Hebrew school class on Tuesday afternoons could not. What was the specific thing a summer did that no Tuesday afternoon could replicate in the same form? The private Jewish camps of the Catskills varied enormously in cost and access. Surprise Lake Camp documented its founding commitment to access, regardless of ability to pay, sustained through scholarship arrangements for children of families who could not cover the fee. Camp Kinderland, the workmen's circle camp, was organized along similar working-class access principles. Private Jewish camps in the same mountains charged fees accessible only to professional and business families. What this produced inside a single summer's bunk was not a public acknowledgement of economic difference, but its private daily reality. The trunk packed by a mother in a 3-room apartment in Williamsburg, and the trunk packed by a father who drove to the camp rather than take the bus. The counselor who assigned bunks had not been instructed to account for this. The bunk made it visible anyway. A child from Forest Hills whose grandparents' Yiddish was already fading shared a bunk with a child from the Lower East Side, for whom it was still the kitchen language. 6 weeks later, both had changed. What changed in each of them? The Atlas Obscura documentation of Jewish camp life in the 1940s and 1950s is precise. The camps made American Jewish kids understand that they lived in 2 worlds, the Jewish world and the American world, and that both were vital. Not a compromise between them. Both vital. The specific developmental work the camp was doing was not teaching Judaism or teaching Americanism. It was building a child who had lived in both, for long enough to stop feeling the distance between them. The counselor who ran the morning Hebrew session and then coached the afternoon baseball game was not performing a balance. She was being a person for whom both came naturally, and the child who watched her do both in the same afternoon received a demonstration that no classroom lecture about Jewish identity in America could produce. What the camp gave the child in 8 weeks was not a conclusion about who she was. It was the experience of not needing one. The child who carried that home in August. What was different in her from the child who had left on the camp bus in June? Jewish families began moving from Brooklyn, the Bronx, and the Lower East Side to Long Island, New Jersey, and Connecticut through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The New York State Thruway, completed in 1954, made the suburbs accessible by car within the hour. The Catskills Institute documents the Borscht Belt peaking in the 1950s and 1960s and declining from the 1970s onward. The specific conditions that had made the Catskills necessary, the city's summer heat, the density of the tenement apartment, the absence of outdoor space, the need for a specifically Jewish social world outside the restricted hotels, dissolved as Jewish families entered the middle-class American geography of backyard and suburb. The Friday evening Shabbat moved to the suburban synagogue. The Yiddish phrase that came naturally mid-sentence came less naturally to children for whom it was their grandparents' language rather than their own. Many organizational camps closed. The communities they had been built to serve had not disappeared. They had moved. What the camp had been built to hold had changed shape. What did the camp produce for a child who arrived without the pressure that had originally made it necessary? Surprise Lake Camp continues to operate in Cold Spring, New York. Founded in 1902 by the Educational Alliance, it is the oldest Jewish residential summer camp in the United States. Its archives through 1976, 38 cubic feet of documentation, are housed at the 92nd Street Y and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. The camps that did not survive left no archive. What they held, the 8 weeks, the bunk, the Shabbat ceremony at the end of the first week, the newspaper that mixed languages at dinner, was not preserved in any collection. What was preserved was what arrived in the children who passed through the passage. The crossed-out Yiddish phrase, the letter that found its way to something true. The specific thing that arrived between day 3 and day 7. It was in them the way the Catskills were in them, not what they had been taught. What they had been,